Welcome to the Truth Over Comfort show. Today's guest is Derrick Broze, who is here from the Conscious Resistance. He's here to talk about technocracy, surveillance, the digital push for everything, the Great Reset, and all the solutions that he works on, and maybe an update about himself as well. It's great to have you here today, Derrick. How are you doing?
I'm doing great. Thanks for having me on, and happy to learn more about your show and your program.
Yeah. What just for people who aren't kind of familiar with your work, if you could just kind of let people know who you are and what you do.
Sure. So I've been an independent investigative journalist for about 12 years now, and I really just started out as an activist in Houston, Texas, which is where I'm originally from. In 2009, 2010, I was in my early 20s, watched some documentaries, read some books, and just started to question the world around me. And in a big way, I think like many of us out there probably hearing this, I kind of see it as my awakening, wake up experience, if you will. And by that I mean that my life had kind of radically shifted. Not that I was sort of a person that trusted the government or sort of believed the things I saw on mainstream news per se, but generally speaking, I didn't realize how deep the lies go, and how just how much of our world around us is fabricated or hidden from us and kept from us. So that was a pretty big paradigm shift, so much so that I pretty much dedicated my life to it. I've been, I was managing a restaurant, I was a cook, I was just kind of living my life. And when I started to wake up reading these books and going down these rabbit holes, it became sort of all consuming. And I just decided to like fully dive into activism. I stopped paying taxes, and I just kind of radically changed my lives in some different ways. And that was 2010, and I started an activist group, and for about 7 years that was my life, living in Houston, doing everything from marches and protests and rallies to skill shares and building community gardens and doing the activism side of things, cop watching, things like that. But I also over the years started to see that the media, even on the local level in Houston, wasn't doing a great job. And they would report on the Houston Freethinkers, the group I started, and they'd call us a local group of conspiracy theorists and stuff like that. And it really just kind of encouraged me to like. And also I noticed like when I put a camera, even a small little handheld camera, in the face of the local politician or the local police chief, they didn't like that. They didn't like accountability. And so all of those sort of instances kind of encouraged me to just take the journalism side of things a bit more seriously. Started doing, podcasting, hosting online radio shows. And then over the years, it's become what I do on a daily basis. I write articles. I run the website, theconsciousresistance.com, where I do interviews and podcasts. And I've gone on to focus on making documentaries, and I've written a few books. And pretty much my work journalistically, activist, just as a human being, is all about trying to promote localization, decentralization, very much so also trying to help promote solutions and warn anybody who will listen about the world that we're very quickly being ushered into. And so, yeah, I try to do that through activism, through journalism, through public speaking, through music, through whatever means I can think of.
Yeah, so what were just because I spoke to Ryan Christian the other day, we kind of just did an interview about kind of his journey, what topics got him into it, and kind of what he was doing before and now. So what were the kind of the topics that created this paradigm change in your mind?
Well, the first book that really woke me up, well, it was honestly a combination of things that all happened within 1 week. I mean, there was things, of course, building up to that and things after that. But if I had to kind of narrow it down to 1 week, it was things like I had been, I grew up listening to metal and punk music. So I always heard like kind of anti-government lyrics, but I was listening to this band that was literally, their lyrics were about the Federal Reserve, and they were about like central banking. I was like, I was like reading a book. And in fact, the book that I was reading at the time by Jim Marrs, called Rule by Secrecy, I came to find out they were quoting from it directly, and they were using his book as lyrics in their songs. And so I was just kind of having this like, okay, I'm hearing about it through music, and I'm definitely waking up to the message they're saying, and they're talking about New World Order and stuff like that. And then reading Rule by Secrecy from Jim Marrs, as well as his other book, Rise of the Fourth Reich. And then at the same time, this was 2009, 10, around going into Ron Paul's second presidential run. And I wasn't directly involved in that movement, but I knew a lot of people who were, and I did read his book Revolution and Manifesto, which I still think is a pretty like simple summation of the ideas of individual liberty for the modern age. And I also heard him speak right around that time at the University of Houston. And then I was at the local bookstore, and they were still selling DVDs at that time. It was like the very end, 2010. So there was a small section of DVDs, and I remember just going and looking through there, and there was an Alex Jones documentary. I think probably one of his better ones. I don't really listen to him much these days, but he definitely played a role in my early years, and it was Endgame, Blueprint for Global Enslavement, which is like his epic one from 2006 or 2008 or something like that. And so it was that, like that all happened within a week. I'm at the bookstore, I find this Alex Jones documentary, I reading Ron Paul, hear him speak in person, listening to this band and reading this other book. And literally by the end of that, I was, like I said, I was managing a restaurant, I was working at the restaurant, and this guy wanted me to take over his business, my former boss. He eventually became a friend, and he came up to the restaurant, and I was in the back just reading because there was no customers, there was nothing going on. And I remember him coming in there and just saying like, dude, what are you doing? I'm like, I'm chilling. I'm like, I just was obsessively reading this book every second I could get. And he said something like, you're not even, it doesn't even feel like you're here, man. And that was when I realized like I wasn't. I had already like checked out. Like I could give a shit about this job. Like I was ready to just, he wanted me to franchise and take it over and help him launch this big business. I ended up quitting that job, selling all my stuff, and then traveling for 3 months by bicycle, doing on a touring bike, volunteering on farms, January 2011 to April 2011. And when I came back, I just dove headfirst into the activism and everything I mentioned before. But it was really those kind of experiences. I would also say in some ways, things like psychedelics made me more open-minded when I was younger. But in terms of issues, it would be 9/11 truth. It would just be like, definitely I kind of started learning about fluoride really early on, which has become important in my recent work. But yeah, I would say probably the biggest thing was 9/11 truth, and then how that related to the bigger foreign policy questions and everything. Because I was actually in high school when 9/11 happened, and I remember in 2003 getting out of, like, when I graduated, moving into my first apartment, because I graduated high school early and went into my own apartment while my friends were in their second semester of senior year. And I remember watching TV and watching them fucking start bombing Iraq. And for like, I remember at least one of the times watching it thinking like, wow, they're getting a bad guy, and sort of like being young and too naive to really understand what was going on. But then later, once I started to really wake up and making the connections to 9/11 and all this stuff, just really fully understand, like, and I became anti-war after that. So I kind of already I was anti-Bush during those years and anti-war. But the one time I've ever voted for a president was in 2008, 2004, and I voted for John Kerry because I was still in that stage of like, okay, well, this guy's bad, the other side must be the answer or something. So I was starting to wake up, but it wouldn't be till years later that I fully, got the picture.
Yeah, sounds like a classic journey of kind of what most people say, kind of normally stems from 9/11, and then realizing the government, the Democratic Party, and the Republicans, or, whether it's in Britain, Labour and Conservative, and just kind of realizing the sham of it. And they're pretty much the same on most major kind of issues, especially obviously foreign policy and kind of the military machine there. Yeah, just kind of going back to obviously what you kind of focus on. So, I mean, you've done a lot about obviously kind of technocracy and the digital push, things like 5G, and just, the Great Reset, but also kind of solutions to that. Can you just kind of tell people just briefly what technocracy actually is?
Yeah, sure. So, technocracy is a political philosophy that was really popular in North America mainly, but there were some people proponents of it in Europe as well. That was mainly popular in the 30s and the 40s, Canada, United States. And it's sort of the official version of events. If you go look up the Wikipedia page, for example, is that it had its moment in the 30s and the 40s, but then by World War II, it had kind of, faded out and lost popularity and just lost to the pages of history, like many other political philosophies. But I think that this philosophy, when you really look at the way the COVID-19 situation was handled, and you look at just the big tech companies and sort of the merging of corporate big tech and state power, you can definitely see the fingerprints and the influence of the technocrats. So the gentlemen who were involved in that, one of them, his name was Howard Scott, and he formed an organization called Technocracy Inc. And they had magazines, they had clubs all over the U.S. and all over Canada that would meet. And their essential vision was that governments are no longer useful, and that business people were also not the answer, and that the people weren't intelligent enough to really know how to run their lives. So then, rather having government with voting or the people having any say, or having business capitalists running things, there should be another path. And they believe that the answer was to have scientists and the technological experts, or the technocrats, at the top of this, what they called a technate, which is just kind of their vision of essentially a state, but the state would be ran by technological and scientific experts. They would eliminate voting and different means that, even though they're flawed, like I'm not really an advocate of voting, but most people would consider that to be a opportunity for the people to voice their opinions. So they wanted to remove that, though, and say that we were going to use computers, and I think what we would refer to as artificial intelligence now. They didn't have the language back then, but that's what they were describing, using computers and having the technologists, the scientists, the experts at the top kind of micromanaging this machine. At the very top, you would have what they call the technate king, who is going to manage the machines. And the machines, they promised, like all utopians, would be able to determine what was the perfect amount of food and resources that should be given to each region or each state, or whatever you have. And that was how life would be run. And they also described like basically a global police state, a police force, and compromises on individual liberty and freedom of choice. But like most psychopaths / utopians, they couch their vision under like very fluffy positive language. But when you look at it, and even in some of their own words, they admitted that like this would involve compromises on freedom of movement, freedom of choice, and liberty, and things that I think that we hold valuable here. So my argument has been, and as I wrote in my book, How to Opt Out of the Technocratic State, which I first wrote in 2019 and published January 2020, and then we released the second edition, a post-COVID edition, in 2022. It was sort of a warning, a little bit of history, like giving people this information. If you've never heard of technocracy, here's what it is, here's what the originators of it said, and then sort of bringing that to where we're at now, where you've got the Jeff Bezos and the Elon Musks and the Zuckerbergs and the Google CEOs and other Bill Gates of the world, very powerful people who in some cases do work with government, but also have enough money, influence, and technological access to our data, and in many cases to kind of work around governments and to become stronger than them. And their whole idea as well was that they could socially engineer society using technology to achieve the outcomes they wanted. So in our modern times, we talk about things like social credit scores, facial recognition, etc. These are essentially, I argue, the tools for the technocrats. They don't have to hold a gun to your head anymore, like fascism or outright authoritarianism, communism, whatever, something that people can visibly see, like, oh my God, this is scary. Instead, it's more subtle, using the technology to socially engineer, to mass plan and direct society on a whole, and most people just don't even realize it's happening. So I argue that this is the philosophy of at least some of the predator class that's trying to manipulate and rule our world. And that, again, they used COVID-19 as a great example to show how technology could be used to amass more power and to expand their power, and also to direct that social behavior.
Yeah, I'm happy to get onto COVID in a little bit, because that was a very good example of this. And a great kind of book to read about technocracy is obviously Patrick Wood's books. I'll put them up on the screen and the links. I've read both of them. I don't think has he got a third book? Not sure if I've read that one yet on technocracy, but recommend them. They're really easy to understand. He uses the original kind of text as well from obviously the group you mentioned there from in the 1930s. They obviously published their own literature, so you can read that. And as you said, it talks about tracking kind of everything. And just kind of on that note, before we get to, I guess, the digital push of, banking and everything, kind of digitalization of everything, it all goes hand in hand with obviously surveillance. And we've seen that obviously grow massively, obviously this century with the war on terror and things like that. So what kind of some examples, I guess, for people like me, I'm 23. Obviously, you're not too crazy much older that you wouldn't remember, but obviously before the world wasn't quite like this. So pre kind of 9/11 to now, how much has kind of the surveillance state changed, and what was kind of the justifications to use that? Because similar to COVID, it's normally about fear.
So I'm 39. I just turned 39 a couple months ago, and so I do remember a little. Like I remember being a child before 9/11. Of course, like I was 17 when 9/11 happened, so I really wasn't, an experienced adult, and I definitely wasn't paying attention and asking these questions. But since waking up and looking back and kind of having an understanding of, there definitely was a world before 9/11 and a world after 9/11, and I think in many ways COVID was very similar. Like these people advanced their agenda in a great way post 9/11 and post COVID 1984, and we're able to just expand it in so many ways. But so, for example, like I didn't fly before 9/11, but that's one basic example. Is before 9/11, like most countries, like when I fly to Mexico or I just came back from Costa Rica and other countries, you pretty much just use a metal detector. Only the U.S. and maybe UK and a few other places that went along with the war on terror really rapidly expanded their surveillance technology and their invasive nature at the airport. So in the United States, you have to go through a body scanner, and those didn't even come about till later. Like not that didn't even happen immediately after 9/11. Those came after another false flag in the U.S. called the shoe bomber. We had all these other false flags shortly after 9/11, like the underwear bomber and the false flag bomber, and James Corbett and others did great job dissecting those stories, and even Alex Jones back in the day, to show that they were also similar lies. And it just seems like every time one of these false flags or these lies happen, then they're able to expand their agenda. So they pulled a couple of those and then convinced the people like, hey, you want to be safe from terrorists, you got to take your shoes off at the airport now. You got to like let us pat down your crotch and do all this stuff. Or you got to go through this body scanner. Pay no attention to the fact that some U.S. politicians are invested in this company and are going to profit off of it. That's irrelevant, So there's things like that where flying became, I think, I didn't fly before 9/11 because I was only 17, or like if I did, I was a kid. I don't remember it, but I imagine it was probably a more enjoyable experience than it is currently because, I just flew back from Atlanta the other day, and now they're testing out facial recognition. All of this we can trace back to 9/11, like especially in the post 9/11 years. I definitely remember being anti-George Bush and like protesting, and I was in a band and speaking out about it. And at that time, definitely in the U.S., it was not a safe thing to speak out. Like, people would say, left wing, right wing, whatever. It was just like expected that you're supposed to be patriotic and just go along with the war on terror. And it's like, people would start screaming, I had friends and family that died, like, just getting all emotional if you even just said, maybe we shouldn't be bombing all these Iraqis that have nothing to do with this. Maybe, we should, because, I think a safe estimate is around 1 million Iraqis who were killed post 9/11 by the United States and by the UK and other allied governments that work together to start bombing and going into Iraq, right? So I think we had a major shift in the mentality of Americans and probably in other countries as well, where it became more accepted that, yeah, it's okay to go do these things because, hey, 9/11, the 24/7 excuse for anything you want, right? That's basically how the government used it. And so you had a more I wouldn't even say patriotic, but like jingoist, like sort of like xenophobic, bad brown people, whatever. There was definitely that mentality very strong after 9/11. A lot of people forget that, and like how invasive, like in parts of New York City and others, they were just doing stop and frisk and just stop. It became a total police state. You could justify almost anything because of 9/11, and it progressively got worse. It took a couple of years, but we had the launch of the global war on terror. And then again, another aspect of that some people don't think about is that the global war on terror gave the U.S. military all kinds of abilities and new toys and tools that they previously didn't have. But because 9/11, a state of emergency was declared, all sorts of things, the Constitution was basically shredded and is pretty much null and void at this point. Every president has since then, including Donald Trump, has extended this emergency. So they're still under emergency powers as far as they're concerned. And so they believe if there's a terrorist that is somehow a danger to the United States in a different country, they can just drone bomb them there or go after them or hunt them down, or they can do what they call rendition, kidnapping, take them to some foreign black site and torture them, or what do they call it, enhanced interrogation, and all this kind of crap that they tried to justify. But not only that, those weapons eventually make their way back to the United States. There's this federal program called the 1033 program, or at least that's what it used to be called. Maybe it has a different name now. And it basically allows the military, once they have like a surplus of these tools, whether it's the freaking like Ninja Turtle helmets we see most cops wearing now. That didn't used to be normal. Like your local cop was just looking like a regular local cop. Now they're all like blacked out, heavy gear, and that came from military weapons. Like this is essentially a surplus program that allows the military to then sell their toys to local departments. So that's why you end up with some small town in the middle of America that's got like a little mini tank or something, or they have drones now. And there's a lot of police departments that took advantage of that. So again, the war on terror not only affected people internationally and foreign nations, but it made its way back here to the United States to participate, kind of helping along the militarization of the police back at home. And so there's just so many unforeseen and maybe foreseen by some people, but often unforeseen and unnoticed consequences of the war on terror, besides like the loss of freedoms, the justification for all sorts of horrible things. I do think 9/11 in many ways set the stage for what we saw with COVID. I mean, we know about like the anthrax attacks, and a lot of the same players that were involved in those stuff were involved in different aspects of COVID-19. So I have a brother who's a couple years older than you. He's 26, and so he barely remembers. He was like 4 years old when 9/11 happened too. So it might be kind of similar to you, that it really wasn't like for me, like the JFK thing has always been fascinating, but I wasn't even alive, right? But 9/11 happened when I was in high school. I remember like them putting it on TV for a while. I remember like, oh my God, something big is happening. So I can kind of have a reference point of before and after. But I think if you came along afterwards, or if you're too young to remember it, the important thing to know is that it was definitely a fracturing point, and that these people in the Bush administration and the Tony Blair administration over there, and really all the different governments that partnered together, use this as a way to grab more power. And then just like COVID, they used it again. Like they're always going to do these sort of things, big and small, but 9/11 was a big one. Economically, especially, there's that whole side that James has covered, the financial people. It's just like these operations, as I'm sure you're coming to learn and find out, like they're multi-layered and they seem to serve multi-purpose. It wasn't just about let's get to Iraq and get the oil. That was probably part of it, but there was also all these other people who benefited financially, just in so many different ways. They moved the New World Order agenda forward in different ways. Like it seems like when they do big events like this, they're able to kind of knock out multiple goals in one fell swoop.
Yeah, I think it's pretty incredible that they still declare a national emergency because of 9/11. Joe Biden obviously did it as well. Like you said, mentioned Trump. Well, it's good to mention Trump, so people obviously follow him know he obviously carries on these same policies other presidents did that they obviously hate. And, with after 9/11, you have the rise of the Patriot Act in America, and then, surveillance, wiretapping without obviously warrants, all this stuff. And then just the kind of the normalization of no privacy as we grow into the tech world and social media. And obviously big tech again, everything always seems to come back as well to the national security state. And 2013 Snowden's revelations with the tech companies working with intelligence agencies, and then just now tech companies pretty much just openly obviously get contracts with the military itself. But obviously alongside this actual surveillance from the national security state, we have the push to kind of digitize everything. So obviously COVID is a good example of that. How much have we seen an acceleration over the last kind of 10 to 15 years of just the digitization of everything, and that kind of world?
Yeah, James, I keep mentioning James because, of course, he's just like set the standard for so many of us, and we wouldn't be doing what we're doing without him. But his work on 9/11, I think, as I mentioned, there's a financial side of it, but he also showed the foreign policy where COVID was related. There was people who benefited financially from knowing what stocks to get into and all that sort of thing. But I think the bigger picture with COVID was the advancement of what you're talking about, like what the biosecurity state, as well as the digitization of everything and moving us further into this, what I call the technocratic state, which again, this is technocrats using a technocratic philosophy, the idea that machines, AI, technology should run everything. Well, how do you move people further into that world other than the same tactic you've always used, which is fear? You get people afraid, lock them in their homes, tell them they can only communicate through digital means, get them to start carrying a digital ID, call it a vaccine passport, immunity passport, and start getting people accustomed to these things under the guise of keeping them safe. Just like with 9/11, people were willing to take their shoes off at the airport before, in a way they never had before, to get themselves groped or to go through microwave machines and all kinds of major changes, really just like that, without much thought, because 9/11. And hey, do you want this to happen again? We have to do anything possible. If you see something, say something. They really created a total shift in mindset. And now going into COVID era and like people being afraid of germs or viruses or whatever, and not even, and to the point that they're not even willing to question what the government does in response. We saw all sorts of people, both politicians and celebrities and just regular everyday people, our neighbors and friends, willing to justify all kinds of crazy shit the last 4 years because they would say, hey, like, we got to protect grandma, or we got to protect the young ones, or whatever it may be. So again, they're using fear tactics to try to further these agendas. And unfortunately, it worked really well. I mean, getting the schools shut down while the schools were shut down in the United States, and I'm sure it's probably similar in many first world nations, they started installing things like 5G, as well as getting kids more comfortable with using the computers everywhere. So now you got like Google laptops in all sorts of public schools. So the kids are already getting trained on Google's devices, which we know are like using the facial recognition camera. There's been plenty of instances where the kids are, even before COVID, where kids are taking home the computers from school and the camera is active and they're watching them at home, whether that's a creepy teacher or just Google trying to learn how to advertise better or whatever. So there's that aspect of just getting the kids and the public in general used to being on the devices all the time. But then they were also installing facial recognition at the schools. They were installing heat detectors because somehow that's going to detect COVID or something like that. All these things that didn't really make any sense. And I also think that the masks, the masks, besides the sort of health arguments, I do think the mask was there's the sort of, you have people complaining about it from a health stance, which I believe. Like, I never wore a mask, unless like I had to get something done, which was not rare. It was very rare. I basically chose to change where I was going and change who I was doing business with in order to not wear it. But there's also the concern of like, it's symbolic, it means like slavery and stuff like that. I hear those arguments. The other one, though, I think is, because I had some friends say, why are you complaining about getting to wear a mask? We're getting to have more, anonymity while we're in public. But actually, you can look up some good reporting and studies out there in China and elsewhere. But they were actually using the masks to train the AI to help it detect us without, even while we're wearing a mask, like being able to focus on the shapes of your ears or just different parts of your face. So if an AI facial recognition has trouble with your face mask on, well, you were training them every time. We were unwittingly training them to become stronger and smarter and learning how to detect people. So I think there's some evidence that all of that was about advancing those agendas. And then I mentioned like the digital IDs, getting people accustomed to that, contact tracing, installing apps on your phone that are going to tell the companies where you're going and tell the governments where you're going. They've already got so many people primed and ready for digital IDs, which are, I know that recently the European Union, they're now talking about, they're supposed to move forward with their digital ID plan very soon. The United States is testing out what they're calling digital driver's licenses or mobile driver's licenses in different states. They're starting to roll out facial recognition in the airports. So all of this stuff was already in the works prior to COVID, but COVID just made it easier to kind of push it through even faster, which again is exactly what we saw with 9/11. You see these agendas kind of slowly, gradually moving forward. Some major event comes along, and then we can take a rapid fire step and I think that, whatever you want to call it, New World Order, technocratic state, they took at least 10 major steps forward the last few years, and we're definitely able to get their agendas closer. And you could add also discussions on like the metaverse and the virtual world's getting more people accustomed to that. I mean, there's a lot of different layers here, but overall, I do think COVID, it achieved that biosecurity state, having people, like, they realize like we can basically scare people, whether it exists or doesn't exist. You can just scare people and tell them something bad's happening out there and show them enough scary videos on the internet. And a certain portion of the population will lock themselves in their homes and stay until they're told to come out. I mean, it's pretty disturbing, honestly.
Yeah, and I think with that, even, COVID obviously was very polarizing for people's opinions. So, if you are listening and you was maybe more on board at the time and you've changed your mind, or you're still kind of believing, obviously, what you thought at the time, you have to see it in the perspective of they still they outwardly came out, Trudeau, people like Klaus Schwab openly said, this is a chance to get basically over the line preconceived goals to what happened. Same as 9/11. Whatever you believe about 9/11, who did it, they still used it to, obviously go into these other countries, but also to bring in these new intrusive laws. Again, with COVID, you have to see there was, things before COVID, like the Better Than Cash Alliance, things like that, ID 2020, all this stuff. That then, during COVID, they're like, well, this is why we need to get rid of cash. A justification for something they already wanted to do, or digital IDs. Again, whatever you think about the vaccine, the digital ID was pretty obvious. I mean, there's loads of tech companies signing up for it who are obviously going to benefit themselves. And there's loads of companies said this is our chance to use it to then go on to banking and everything else. So whatever you believe about it, you have to kind of see that it is used. And you may have agreed with it at the time, but there's going to be one in the future where you're like, hang on, no, this isn't right. You mentioned 5G there, so can you just explain to people what it actually is? Obviously, again, during COVID, there was a lot of just chaos with it and misinformation and people doing the actual real threats and damage, like obviously in England, people burning down the 5G towers, or people saying COVID didn't exist, it's just 5G, takes the legitimate privacy issues or actual long-term health effects and basically poo-poos it into you bring up 5G and you're like, oh, you're one of those people who believes COVID doesn't exist. So what is 5G, and what's it kind of for, and how long has it kind of been around? I mean, it's been around obviously a few years, and people like the CIA director at the time said, we can use this basically to spy on you through your dishwasher, stuff like that.
Yeah, so I mean, I think you did a pretty good job outlining it there. I mean, I've started investigating, learning. So I started hearing about concerns about EMFs, electromagnetic frequencies, or RFR, radio frequency radiation. These words are often used when discussing cell phones, Wi-Fi, Bluetooth. And so the cell phone networks, they operate on different frequencies, different bands, frequency bands. The first generation, or 1G, came about in the 90s with like the first iteration of early phones. Then you had the second generation, early 2000s. Third generation is like the beginning of smartphones. And then 4G. So that's one thing to understand, is that just describes like the different specific frequency band. And so whenever the 1G phones were out, we were operating on this band. And as more people start using phones, they need more frequency bandwidth. So it grows and it changes. That's kind of what that terminology means. So the 5G, in the most simplest terms, is just the fifth generation of spectrum band that all of the newer devices are supposed to operate on. And there will be 6G in the coming years, and there will be 7G and 8G and on and on. It's just how they word that. Now, they are based on different frequencies, though. So 1G is not the same thing as 5G. So that's important to understand. But the other thing to understand is that there have been concerns about EMFs and the frequencies within 1G, 2G, 3G, 4G, all the way going back to the very beginning in the 90s. Most people are focused on it because of 5G and just because it's become more of a movement, which is a good thing overall. But the reality is, even if you don't have 5G in your house, when we're being exposed, as we currently are right now, as we're talking through the internet, to electromagnetic frequencies, it does have an impact on our body in different ways. And there are potential health concerns. Like you said, most of them are longer term. It's not like I sit in front of a computer right now and, I'm not going to have kids or something. But if I sit with my cell phone in my pocket all day long and it's next to my testicles, that could have an impact, and it could impact my ability to have children. Though there are real world impacts, but it's not from one exposure, it's from long-term exposure. But there's a study, actually a lawsuit that's still ongoing in the United States. It's been going for 20 years, and I think it's supposed to resume this year, involving a gentleman who was using, I think, the first or second generation of cell phones. And he was like a guy who was like one of the early adopters, business type, just on the phone all day, making business calls and stuff, like one of these giant phones. And he ended up getting brain tumors right behind his ear, right behind where he would carry the phone. He filed a lawsuit, and like I said, this lawsuit's been going on for 2 decades now. He's since died of the brain tumor, but his family is continuing the lawsuit But the reason it's taken so long is because big wireless, the companies behind the cell phones and behind 5G and stuff, they are an immensely powerful lobby and industry. I think they're often overlooked. We talk about big tech like the Facebook and social media companies, but there's also big wireless, and you got T-Mobile and AT&T and all the ones all around the world. They all kind of eventually come to these bigger groups, international groups, conglomerates. Like in the United States, it's called the CTIA, the Cellular Telephone Internet Association, and they basically represent all the telecoms in the U.S. You have similar bodies all around the world, and then there's an international body, much like with banking and everything else. My point is that these companies are a very big influence. They buy a lot of advertising money, and they try to suppress any research that could get the public talking about the health harms. But in addition to the health harms, there's the surveillance, privacy concerns that you talked about. And that is because in order for 5G to work, this is what sets it apart from previous generations. Klaus Schwab and many people in the world are saying we want to go into this futuristic society of autonomous vehicles, driverless vehicles, robot assistants, low latency. We can download a 4K movie in 1 second, right? As if we need that. And of course, virtual and augmented reality, the Internet of Things, the Internet of Bodies. This is like the future they describe. And in order for that to work, and they also just talk about like in a future city, we're going to have sensors in the street that will detect what the climate is that day. They sell it under all kinds of utopian things like these people always do. But the point is, for this futuristic world to work, we need much faster technology, and 5G is the first step in that direction. But in order for 5G to work the way they want it to work, they have to install these towers. They're small cells. Sometimes it's brand new towers. Sometimes it's literally just looks like a briefcase, and they'll attach it to a light pole or a phone pole that's already existing. But they have to install them every 200 to 500 feet or whatever that is in meters. It's very close. And in the United States, there's people fighting them because they're putting them right next to schools. They're putting them next to churches, putting them next to people's homes, because if you're going to put them 200 to 500 feet, that's a lot of poles. And the U.S. Federal Communications Commission, which is the one that regulates are supposed to regulate cell phones and kind of frequencies like this, estimates that they're going to need up to 500,000 new towers in the coming 5 years or so all over the country in order for this to work properly. So you put that everywhere, not only are people going to be exposed to levels of radio frequency radiation that we've never experienced in any time in history, but it does bring in the privacy concerns, because each of these devices can also essentially form this surveillance grid around us. Not to mention the fact that, like, if everybody starts going to driverless vehicles, it's going to be very easy for the governments of the world to determine where you can drive and how often you can drive, and whether if you maybe with your digital ID connected to this whole system, if you've been posting conspiracy theories on the internet, they just turn off your digital ID, and you're not allowed to get an Uber or whatever the driverless vehicle is at the time until you do some good works, or you don't have enough carbon credits this week to ride along in a vehicle. So this world, 5G is kind of the backbone to that technocratic dystopia we were describing earlier. Like, they can't build that world without it bringing about 5G. And so I started investigating it back in 2018 when Houston actually became the first city in the United States to install 5G. There was a lot of misinformation, and still is, about Wuhan, China being the first place in the world with 5G and stuff, but Houston had it since at least 2018, and not a full scale, but definitely they started installing it around the city. And that's when I first started investigating and confronting the previous mayor of Houston, who was deeply tied to the telecom lobby. And I got to interview the CEO of Verizon and ask him about the health concerns. And both of them claimed they had no idea. And that just kind of led me down a rabbit hole. And eventually I produced a documentary called The 5G Trojan Horse. And this was about a year before I started to make the connection to how 5G was. I knew there was privacy concerns and smart cities and all this sort of stuff, but I hadn't quite connected it to the larger technocratic philosophy. But yeah, my documentary, it's on theconsciousresistance.com if anybody wants to check it out. It just follows my journey as I do the investigating, and I go to city council and try to bring them all the data that I'm finding. Then I just keep finding how deep this web goes, and it doesn't look good. 5G, smart cities, technocracy, these issues are very interrelated, and they're selling it to, like, just for example, here in Houston, fourth largest city in the United States, so it's a major city. So of course, this is where you're going to see some of this stuff rolling out. Now they're installing these digital billboards around the city, and these digital billboards, they have convenient information like, hey, here's this festival this weekend, or remember, Easter's coming up, or whatever kind of crap, or hey, put your mask on, COVID's out. It's for propaganda as well. but they have cameras on them, like they're very difficult to see. Like you can walk by it, not even detect. But this is just one more example of like smart city technology, right? So it's smart, it's giving you tips, and it can like tell you directions or whatever. It's like a giant tablet on the sidewalk, basically. But it's listening to you, it's watching you, and I've done the investigative work into it. Like there's no guarantee on how long they're keeping that information or what exactly they're doing with it. And that's just one piece of what they want us to be living in. They want us to live in this smart city where we have driverless cars, smart assistants, robot assistants, all this stuff. And maybe, you know, the Neuralink and the glasses or some sort of augmented reality aspect of it. And honestly, like I think some of this stuff could be really freaking cool. Like I love sci-fi. I love like I want to live in this future if it wasn't being run by psychopaths. But so they're going to sell it to people under the guise of convenience, and it will be convenient in some ways for the short term. Or entertainment, like it's super cool. Like, look, you can experience the world in a new, fun way. But in the end, it is really going to be us compromising on our privacy and our liberty, and I think, and our freedom of movement eventually. And so this is why a lot of my work focuses on trying to not only educate people about these problems, but trying to ask, what can we do? Like, is it possible to get out of these systems before it's too late? Is it too late? And, you know, and what are we going to do? How are we going to relate and to continue to relate and reframe our relationship with technology? I have my solutions and I have some ideas, but ultimately you, everybody listening to this, we all have to decide as individuals or as families, as communities, how we're going to interact with this technology as it moves forward. Because there's no way, and I don't think that would be the answer, there's no computer to go smash and then it's over, we won. You know, there's no single point of failure. Like it's an ideology, but it's also up to us. In many ways, we are voluntarily walking into this world, and so we have to decide what we're going to participate in and what we're going to reject.
Yeah, no, that was really well laid out there. I mean, with the 5G, I mean, you don't have to always even look at it from, because the problem is when people bring up issues with 5G, and then there's always the craziest theory on Facebook that gets some fact check and people read about. You know, you don't even have to look at it from the really most nefarious, you know, it's going to give you cancer or anything. You know, everyone knows that, you know, that much technology around you is probably not good for you. I mean, everyone knows, you know, working at an office job, looking at a screen all day isn't good for you. Like when you're in nature, everyone feels just kind of naturally better. You know, you don't have to be a hippie or anything. When you're in like a forest or a field, you do just naturally feel a bit better. The air just seems to be kind of a bit fresher. So like it's not a big jump to say with all this technology. And like you said, with 5G, has to be every couple, you know, 100 feet. That there's just that much around you. You know, normally, you know, you obviously see the phone line poles and then, you know, the electric grids and fields. But imagine that constantly all around you. You can't say that, no, that's definitely going to be fine because there's not enough long-term kind of research. And the same with the vaccine. It could be, you know, end up being way more safe than we thought. But until you get that long-term research, you don't know. There's obviously that massive push for, well, we need all this technology now. You know, we need virtual reality now. We need everything now, rather than going, we're a pretty good level of technology. You know, maybe let's just put the brakes on, make an assessment of where we're at and what it's kind of doing to our health, and then kind of go from there, rather than we just, you know, live in a society of the new iPhone's out. I want it now. You know, it doesn't matter. It's exactly the same or whatever. And with the 5G, I mean, again, from your work, I recommend people watching that documentary. But there was loads of scientists kind of around the world and in the EU that did generally take this to the European Parliament and say, you know, we don't know the long-term effects. We should put the brakes on. And again, I know you did some work on 5G and COVID and spoke to James Corbett, and you know, there's obviously a lot of myth out there about it. But it was strange in kind of the UK that obviously they used it as an opportunity, but all these 5G towers went up during this, you know, health pandemic, and it's, you know, if you really cared about health, maybe you'd go, well, you know, during COVID, we're during a pandemic, maybe let's not put the 5G towers up yet, because, you know, we don't know the most if they really cared about your health. But a lot of them kind of, you know, got snuck up then. But before we kind of finish up, and, you know, I'd love, I mean, another time to maybe get your thoughts on how, I guess, kind of the whole sustainable development and climate kind of agenda comes into this, because obviously I'm sure people who've watched you by now can tell, you know, might look at you as someone who would, care about the environment and the world, but not necessarily mean that you believe in climate alarmism. But I'll put that on hold for now. But just, because I know obviously you're a big kind of solutions guy. You've written a book about it. You've done lots around it. So, what kind of basic solutions you can give everyday people who aren't willing to go completely off the grid? It's just not possible for most people. So, what kind of little things people can do to kind of opt out or things like that?
Yeah, absolutely. And I'm happy to address your question about the climate. I think that's an important part. So in terms of like what you can do, so I mean, I'll just give a little bit more about myself, and so people understand where I'm coming from. I haven't used a bank since 2008, and by that I mean like I don't have a bank account. I don't go deal with the banks, and that wasn't really anything to do with me waking up. It was just like I was young and I got my first bank account, and then I started overdrafting, and the next thing I know, they claimed I owed them some fees, and I was like, I kind of suck at this bank thing. But then, of course, years later, I realized like, okay, yeah, I don't think I'm going to go back. I don't want to support these institutions. In the United States, you got options like Chase Bank, who are the people that helped launder money for Jeffrey Epstein and stuff like that. So I mean, I don't really want to support that. And I don't have a relationship with the tax collection agency of the United States. I don't talk to them. So I kind of stay out of systems, but of course, like I'm an everyday person that still has to go interact with the world, and I have to use U.S. dollars at the moment if I'm going to pay rent, or if I'm in Mexico, I'm still using the government currency, the peso. But I also do try to use things like Monero, private cryptocurrency, when I can, either to sell my goods and services or to buy goods and services. As I mentioned, I try not to use the mainstream banking system. So I do try to exist out, I guess, on the extreme or some of the edges, and work with other people who are trying to build what comes next, because ultimately that's what my solutions are about. I don't see hope in the political system. I don't think that we have any hope with some sort of violent insurrection, even if you thought that was the right plan. So I don't think violence or voting are really going to get us too far. Maybe you win some small minor victories on the local level, which, yeah, if you can do that, go for it. But in terms of like voting for presidents, prime ministers, things like that, I don't think that's where we're going to really see big change, and we can't count on the courts to save us from these things. That's at least the perspective I'm coming from. So then if you accept that and you don't accept apathy, which is not what I choose, and I hope nobody here chooses that, then we have to ask ourselves what's actually within our control, what is within our grasp that we can tangibly do something about. And while asking yourself that, I would also ask you to consider that, from my view, COVID showed us the cards that are going to be played by the predator class. It doesn't matter if it's another claimed pandemic, or it's a climate emergency, or it's stage alien invasion, or whatever the heck they choose next, or economic collapse, or the internet goes down, or solar flare, anything you can think of. It really doesn't matter. The details will be different, of course, how we proceed, but ultimately I believe we've seen their cards. They're going to use lockdowns. It could be a pandemic lockdown. It could be climate lockdowns. They're going to use travel restrictions, as we saw during COVID, and they'll use them again in other ways because they were pretty effective. They're going to use public, governmental, and peer pressure on us to try to like make us, coerce us, or they'll try to buy you out with donuts and lap dances, take the shot, do whatever. So we've kind of seen the tools they're going to use. I don't think we've seen every tool, but I would expect that we will see lockdowns, some form of lockdown again, some form of travel restrictions, and it might not be called a vaccine passport anymore, but it'll be like you can't travel without the digital ID, right? So the attacks are coming financially. They're coming for our travel. They're definitely, I think, coming for the children, for the young ones. And then there's also the sort of spiritual, emotional, mental attack. Understanding that, I think it's important to ask, what are we going to do in those areas? You can either just keep the same old bank you got now that is connected to, whoever, and just wait for them to announce they're going to turn all your money into digital currencies, CBDCs, and that it's now programmable and trackable and traceable, and they can turn it off at a whim. You can either just wait to that point and then I guess figure out what you're going to do, or you can start being proactive. You can start thinking ahead and saying, okay, I know that my country, my nation, the government is planning CBDCs sometimes in the coming years. I'm going to start taking a little bit of that money out. First of all, stop using the big bank and use like a local credit union or whatever the equivalent thing is in your home country, wherever you're listening from, because most countries have something similar. There tend to be like community banks. They're more local. They're not part of the bigger bank, apparatus. But some of those same small banks did also require masks and shots to come bank. I heard from people. So those aren't necessarily perfect either. But I think it's about taking steps in the right direction, right? Because you're not necessarily going to be where I'm at, and if that's even your goal, but you're not going to be totally off the grid or whatever your goals are tomorrow. It does take time. So then you want to at least start taking steps in that direction. So you go from a big bank to a smaller local bank. Maybe you start learning more about private cryptos like Monero if you're comfortable, or you look up gold and silver, precious metals. The other thing is you can invest in yourself. Like in hard times, people with skills, whether that's, like you've got a lot of knowledge up here, or you've got practical skills, you can build with your hands. These things are going to be valuable. So if you've got extra money laying around, like invest in yourself, take a permaculture course, take a course on beekeeping or something that you've been wanting to learn that you think would be useful for you now and potentially in the future. Invest in yourself. Like that's another big thing we often forget about. People think about investments just in terms of, oh, I got gold, I got metal, I got this, and in the US I got guns, things like that. But you also got to have skills yourself, and that could be also investing in yourself by, you know, working out once a week to stay in reasonable shape. Like these things are often overlooked by the freedom movements, I think, taking care of ourselves mentally, physically as well. You could go to, their whole plan is going to be based on pushing us onto big tech platforms using the cell phones, smartphones. You could ditch the smartphone, but that's not likely for most people. You could then instead consider getting a privacy-based phone. You could look up nomoregoogle.com. This is a website. I have nothing to do with it. It's just a website I discovered. Nomoregoogle.com, privacytools.io. Both of these are great resources that show you, for somebody who's out there like, oh, I'm on Gmail, I'm using Google Docs, I'm using this and that. If your whole life's on Google, take a step in the right direction. Stop supporting companies that don't care about your privacy. And maybe you learn about CryptPad and you realize that, oh, wow, CryptPad does everything Google does, but it doesn't track and trace me, and they have private privacy, and it's encrypted, and I can host my own node if I want to, or you can just use the platform like you use Google, but you're at least supporting a better company and you're not being spied on. So there's little things like that you can do every day. You can go look up the Above Phone, abovephone.com. That's one of my partners, my buddy Hakeem. He's de-Googling phones, selling them with privacy apps. So everything you're doing, maps, YouTube, etc., you have an alternative. You've got organic maps, or you got Magic Earth, you got what is the New Pipe instead of YouTube, and all these other alternatives doing the same things you're doing, but companies and apps that aren't going to be tracking and tracing you, giving you a little bit more control over your phone, right? So these are all steps, just basic things I'm talking now. This isn't going to stop the New World Order tomorrow, but you're starting to take steps towards privacy, towards not just acquiescing. Because if we know that these things are happening, which I think, like you said earlier, most of us are kind of aware these things are going on and not really healthy for us to be on the devices all the time. But are we doing anything about it? Are we changing our daily habits? Are we changing our routines? And that's what really matters, because I've been saying this a lot lately, like you can be awake and you can still watch things get worse and worse and worse until you're no longer free. So what was the point of being awake if you didn't do anything about it, or if you're awake, but you're miserable and you're like, oh, I'm so conscious, I'm so aware, these sheeple are so dumb. But what are you doing about it? Are you actually taking any tangible steps to stay free, to stay, awake and alive? And for me, it's important that we, just like these people, what I call the predator class, they think generationally, they think long term. We need to get back to doing that. We have been conditioned to be so much in the moment, especially those of us who grew up with social media, to just be worried about how many likes do I have now and what's going on. Let me go to the next reel, the next short, the next video, and just do that all day. We're just in the moment, which can be a good thing in some cases, but you got to balance that out and think ahead as well, while these people are laying down plans that they know their grandchildren are going to continue to advance. They're thinking gradually and incrementally and generationally. And I think that's sort of what we needed to be doing, is thinking ahead. We see the plans that they have, Agenda 2030, Sustainable Development Goals, all that stuff. It's 2024. We're not that far off from this, and it's not like 2030 magic, all of a sudden we're in tyranny. It's going to start to appear before then. The signs are already there, right? So if we know it's coming, we have a choice. Do we choose to act and start trying to think of whatever potential solutions? And I talk about this in my book. I do give out some ideas. People can download it for free at theconsciousresistance.com/how-to. There's an audio book. There's an English version, a Spanish version. We got German now, and some other languages are coming. I have some ideas there. Check them out. Use what works for you. Adapt, add to them. The point is, we need to be thinking about this, because this isn't some far off future. This is happening right now. And especially if you're anybody out there who has children or plans to have children, you really need to think about the world that we're going to be leaving for them, and in terms of freedom, privacy, and it doesn't look good. So it's up to those of us who see what's going on to exit from those slavery systems and try to build and support those who are building new systems so that we can continue to survive and thrive into the future.
again, yeah, really well laid out there. Some good, obviously, solutions and little ones people can do. Yeah, I guess. I mean, even myself, obviously, I run this channel. I watch all this stuff. I mean, I've kind of been caught up in foreign policy, but I mean, even myself, I've still got a long way to go with this. But yeah, I think incremental little things is the best way to move. And just again, during COVID was the best example of seeing, what people like you and others have said. Doesn't matter what you think about COVID or the vaccine, they created a digital ID that if you didn't get this vaccine for this, again, forget the reason, you were going to be shut out of society, travel, nightclubs, wherever, you were just been shut out. And that's clear evidence, again, an example of if they get rid of cash, that last bit of freedom you have to operate, and it's all digital, then you're stuck. Again, if there's a digital ID, which companies again spoke about, this is just the first step. The vaccine, they go to banking, health, travel, everything. If it's all on one digital system, they can lock you out of, like they tried to do with COVID and vaccine. Yeah, it doesn't. Then a few years later, you take a look back and you go, "Oh yeah, the Iraq War, that was obviously complete rubbish." Or COVID, yeah, maybe it wasn't as bad as we thought. So I think that's a really good example to show people of what they tried to do. They showed their hand, and how scary it could be if you was on the other side of that. But thanks for coming on. I appreciate you've got to jump off soon, but I really enjoyed talking to you. And I'll put obviously everything up on the screen and in the show notes to your website, your book, and everything else they need to see.
Awesome, brother. Thank you. Thank you. I appreciate you having me on. And yeah, thanks for the chance to share some ideas. I'll just mention, because I know you asked about it, if you or anybody is interested in my particular take on the Sustainable Development Goals and Agenda 2030, I did write about that in the second edition of How to Opt Out of the Technocratic State. And like most things I try to do, I try to propose an alternative. So we talked about the autonomous development goals. I do think it's worth fighting for the planet, not in the way that they talk about, where we should subvert humanity, in the interest of the planet. As we know that these people, they have a very anti-human agenda and they like to hide it behind utopian goals. I don't think at the top these people give a damn about the planet or anything like that. I've also talked about ideas like permaculture and how we could have, I think I have a video on my website called Decentralized Environmentalism that talks about this, how you could still care about the environment, and it doesn't have to mean advancing sustainable development goals. And in fact, we shouldn't be afraid of the word sustainable just because they use it that way. I mean, it's not a bad thing in its own self, but we should also be willing to see the propaganda and recognize, what does matter. For me, what matters is I want clean water, I want clean air, I want access to good, healthy food without pesticides and without crap sprayed on it or in the food, in the water. And I think most of us want that, and so there's nothing wrong with that. We should be able to focus on that and separate the bullshit from it. So thanks again, brother, for giving me the chance to share with your audience.
Yeah, no, I think you're right there, separating it and not throwing everything away just because of those thoughts there. And obviously, again, for people who don't know, you're a pretty fair guy. Obviously, you looked into COVID and 5G. You're not the type who just jumps on every single theory out there. But yeah, thanks again for coming on, and I'll speak to you soon.